The biggest question is what happened to Nolan Wells. I think the reason this case has caught such fire is because they see the pictures, they see the video, and they're saying, hold on, you're trying to tell us just accept this as an accident and sweep it under the rug? His mother, Christine, his father, Elmo, say no, they will not allow that to happen.
The local sheriff is screaming accidental drowning, but independent investigators are looking at a body that tells a completely different story. Why did attorney Ben Crump bypass Mississippi officials entirely and fly Nolan Wells' body straight to Washington, D.C.? Because of 3 brutal physical red flags on that teen's body that local pathologists are actively glossing over. We are talking about specific trauma marks that prove a fight happened long before water ever touched his lungs. If this was just a tragic accident, why is the state locking down the lab results for weeks? Here is what they are hiding. To uncover the truth behind America's most baffling mysteries, hit that subscribe button right now. Welcome to the U.S. Crime Cases channel. Let us begin. To really understand what we are looking at today, we have to go back to the very beginning of this timeline and look at the undisputed facts. According to the police report, this all started on the 4th of July. 18-year-old Nolan Wells headed out with a group of friends for a boat trip to Horn Island. Now, if you're not familiar with the area, Horn Island is this beautiful, somewhat remote barrier island off the coast of Mississippi. It's a popular spot, especially on a major holiday weekend. People take their private boats out there to anchor, swim, and just hang out. Nolan was a high school graduate getting ready to head off to play college football. According to his family, he was a physically fit, elite athlete in peak condition. He was a strong swimmer. He had his whole life ahead of him. So you can imagine the absolute shock and heartbreak when the sun went down on that holiday and Nolan was nowhere to be found. The story we get from the authorities is that his friends left the island without him. According to the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, witnesses stated that Nolan voluntarily chose to stay behind on the island. The official narrative suggests that he planned to catch a ride back to the mainland later with another group of people, right? On the surface, maybe teenagers changed their plans, but then we get to a detail that completely fractured the public's trust in that story. When his friends returned to the mainland, they had Nolan's cell phone and his keys. As stated by the family attorney, Ben Crump, this witness account features glaring contradictions. It simply defies logic that a young man would voluntarily stay behind on an island while letting his friends drive away with his only lifelines to the outside world. To counter this, a parent of one of the friends present on the trip told media outlets that the boat they were on started having issues with its bilge pump, and they had to leave quickly. They also claimed that leaving phones on a boat dashboard is standard practice to prevent saltwater damage while teenagers are out swimming in the Gulf. I see. You can understand why someone might leave a phone on a boat while in the water, but letting that boat leave for the mainland without you, while it holds your keys and phone, is where the family draws the line. The family reported him missing that night. For 2 excruciating days, search and rescue teams scoured the waters around the barrier island. Then, on the morning of July 6, a U.S. Park Service ranger made the devastating discovery. Nolan's body was recovered in the water near the northwest tip of Horn Island. Almost immediately, the community and the family started asking for answers. They wanted to know exactly how a healthy, strong, young athlete ended up dead in the water. This is where the official state response really started to clash with what the family believed. According to the coroner, Bruce Lind, the preliminary state medical evaluation performed on July 8th noted no immediate, obvious external trauma. Based on that initial visual and physical exam, local authorities stated they preliminary suspect drowning. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department put out a statement saying there was currently no evidence of foul play. Wow. You have a grieving family looking at a highly suspicious timeline, and within days, the local police are already leaning toward a tragic accidental drowning. But let's take a step back and look at what a preliminary medical evaluation actually means. It is just the first layer of the process. According to the coroner, a standard preliminary scan cannot entirely rule out all forms of foul play until deeper microscopic lab work is completed. They are looking at the surface of the skin, checking for obvious breaks or massive blunt force trauma. However, this disagreement forced a massive public discussion about whether that kind of surface scan is enough. Medical experts will tell you that detecting deep tissue trauma before advanced decomposition sets in requires much more than just a visual once-over. The state insists that even strong swimmers can succumb to unpredictable Gulf currents, sudden drop-offs, and shifting tides. They argue that the ocean does not care how fast you can run or how much you can lift in the weight room. But the family absolutely rejects this finding. They refuse to accept that timeline and immediately commissioned an independent autopsy, physically bypassing the state system by flying Nolan's body out of Mississippi entirely. You might wonder why a family would go to such extreme lengths, moving a body across state lines to a facility in Washington, D.C. As stated by the family attorney, there is a deeply documented history of distrust toward local Mississippi authorities when it comes to investigating the deaths of young minority men. They simply don't believe the local system will give them the unfiltered truth. They brought in independent forensic pathologists to look for the exact physical markers the state might have glossed over. The independent team is looking for specific indicators of a struggle before Nolan ever went into the water. They are looking for defensive wounds under the fingernails. They are checking the deep tissue in his arms and neck for bruising that would indicate he was held down or struck while his heart was still beating. If a fight happens and someone is injured while alive, the blood pools in the tissue completely differently than it does from post-mortem lividity. The family is searching for that concrete, indisputable scientific proof to present in a courtroom. Meanwhile, the local authorities have essentially locked down their final ruling. The state medical examiner is waiting on a full toxicology report before they officially close the book on the cause of death. People online are furious about this delay, asking what the state is hiding. But if we look at standard forensic science, the reality is that complex blood and organ screening simply takes weeks. The lab has to run gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to break down the biological samples. They are looking for trace amounts of sedatives, alcohol, or any substance that could have incapacitated Nolan before he drowned. The state says this is just standard procedure and that rushing the science would be irresponsible. The police said they cannot legally release a final report until those technicians finish their work. But when you have a community that already feels the local sheriff is screaming accidental drowning without thoroughly investigating the friends, that standard waiting period feels like a deliberate cover-up. The tension between how it happened and what is going on right now is thick enough to cut with a knife. As if the medical debate was not intense enough, a completely new layer of evidence has been thrown into the mix. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office recently made a public plea asking anyone who was on Horn Island that day to submit their raw, unedited cell phone videos. Does this indicate that digital evidence is going to play a larger role in establishing the timeline than the initial medical report? It certainly seems like it. Shortly after the tragedy, a short video clip started circulating widely on social media. It appeared to show a heated argument happening on the crowded beach of Horn Island on the 4th of July. The police said they are actively investigating that specific piece of footage to see if it connects to Nolan's disappearance. We don't know for sure who was in that video, but the court of public opinion has already made up its mind. People are scrutinizing every frame, wondering if it captures the very altercation the independent investigators are trying to prove happened. If that video is verified, it shatters the peaceful narrative of friends just hanging out until a boat broke down. So we are left standing between two completely different realities. On one side, local authorities are following standard, slow-moving bureaucratic protocols. They are looking at a tragic drowning and waiting on the science to confirm it, insisting there is zero verified proof of a crime. On the other side, an outraged family and a powerhouse legal team are digging into the physical body, searching for the microscopic truth that they believe Mississippi is trying to wash away. They are analyzing the timeline, the missing phone, and the behavior of the witnesses, and they are demanding justice for a teenager who should be getting ready for football camp right now. We have to follow the evidence closely because whatever comes out of that independent lab in Washington, D.C. is going to dictate whether this remains a closed accident or explodes into a full-scale federal homicide investigation. You know, when you sit down and look at what the internet is saying versus what the actual police reports state, it can feel like you are looking at two completely different realities. Right now, there is an unverified claim circulating all over social media asserting that the independent autopsy found defensive bruising on Nolan Wells' forearms. Just think about that for a second. Putting yourself in the shoes of the people who loved him. We are talking about an 18-year-old kid who went out to celebrate a summer holiday. He was an athlete, someone with his whole future mapped out. To imagine him having defensive wounds is a truly heavy, agonizing thought for any parent to carry. It changes the entire narrative from a tragic accident to a desperate fight for survival. But if you look at the official police report, authorities are standing firm. They have stated clearly that there are no immediate signs of physical trauma or a struggle. So how do we separate the dark rumors from the clinical reality? Wow, it really all comes down to the complex medical science of evaluating these specific claims. I want to break this down for you just like a close friend would, because the science here is actually fascinating, even if the subject matter is incredibly heartbreaking. You see, investigators have a massive task ahead of them. They have to definitively distinguish pre-mortem bruising from post-mortem skin discoloration. When an altercation happens before water ever enters the lungs, the person's heart is still actively pumping blood throughout their body. If someone takes a blunt force impact during this time, like getting grabbed forcefully by the arms, pushed against the side of a boat, or struck, those tiny blood vessels under the skin rupture. Because the blood pressure is still active, it forces red blood cells out into the surrounding tissue. Medical professionals call this hemoglobin extravasation, but in simple terms, it just means you get a fixed, deep bruise. Once that blood is pushed into the tissue while the person is alive, it stays there. It cannot be washed away by the ocean water, and it does not shift when gravity pulls on the body after death. On the flip side, you have something called postmortem lividity, or livor mortis. This happens after the heart permanently stops beating. Gravity simply takes over and pulls the stagnant blood down to the lowest resting points of the body. This creates dark, purplish patches that can look a whole lot like bruises to an untrained eye or someone guessing on social media. If a forensic pathologist needs to differentiate the two, they actually make a small surgical incision directly into the discolored area. If the blood is clotted tightly within the tissue itself, it means the injury occurred while the young man was still alive. Furthermore, we have to consider the harsh environment of the Gulf. The water currents, the rocks, and the marine life in the Gulf of Mexico routinely cause post-mortem abrasions. These superficial scrapes can visually mimic physical trauma from a fight, but they completely lack the underlying inflammatory response that doctors look for to classify them as actual pre-mortem injuries. I see. It shows you just how complicated it is to look at a body pulled from the water and immediately declare exactly what happened. Then we get to the second major physical red flag people are intensely arguing about, and this one is genuinely tough to talk about. Unverified online commentators are out there claiming that the condition of Nolan's lungs absolutely proves he was forced under the water. But again, we have to look at what the officials say. According to the coroner, the official cause of death is formally deferred. The state is telling the family and the public that they have to wait for the final toxicology and microscopic tissue reports before anyone can make that kind of definitive call. If you haven't subscribed, please hit the button right now. Your support helps U.S. crime cases continue bringing you important truth-seeking investigations every single week. To determine whether a person breathed in water naturally or was somehow incapacitated before going under, pathologists conduct a highly specific airway and lung examination. They do not just guess based on how much water is present. They meticulously measure the exact volume of fluid in the pleural cavities. They analyze the airways, looking for a very specific, undeniable type of froth. Here is the sad reality of a natural drowning. It typically presents with a dense, mushroom-like foam located in the trachea and bronchi. This happens when a conscious person is in severe distress and violently inhales water. That water mixes with the oxygen still trapped in their lungs and the mucosal proteins in their airway during panicked, labored breathing. It creates a physical foam that is very distinct. If an individual is unconscious or, God forbid, already deceased before entering the water, this specific froth simply does not form because there is no active breathing to churn the mixture up. It is a heavy, dark thing to picture, but this is exactly what the independent pathologists in Washington, D.C. are looking for as they examine him. They also check the deep lung tissue, the sphenoid sinus located deep in the skull, and even the bone marrow for sediment and diatoms. Diatoms are these microscopic algae that have distinct silica cell walls. They are literally everywhere in natural bodies of water. By taking tissue samples and dissolving them in nitric acid, forensic scientists can extract these microscopic diatoms and actually compare them to the specific marine ecology of Horn Island. This confirms exactly where and how the water entered his bloodstream. It is incredibly precise, undeniable science that takes an agonizing amount of time. This explains why the state says they need weeks, even while a grieving public is demanding answers today. The third red flag brings us to the most aggressive and persistent rumors currently floating around online. Social media rumors strongly allege that defense evidence, such as skin and DNA, exists right now under Nolan's fingernails. Now, as stated by law enforcement, there is currently no evidence of a physical struggle or foul play whatsoever. The local authorities are maintaining that until the labs say otherwise, this was a tragic accident. But the independent legal team working for the family in Washington, D.C. is actively inspecting the body for these exact physical markers. They are looking to completely challenge the timeline provided by Nolan's friends on the island. When you really think about it, human instinct is to fight back. We all have that survival drive. Pathologists search for this kind of defense evidence by thoroughly swabbing the victim's skin for any foreign genetic material. They also do what is called a subungual scraping, which means they carefully and methodically scrape the area beneath the fingernails. They are looking for anything at all that does not belong to Nolan. Epidermal tissue from another person, synthetic clothing fibers from someone else's shirt, or foreign DNA would clearly indicate that he reached out and scratched an assailant during a physical struggle. Wow, if they find absolutely nothing, the absence of these markers strongly supports the local theory that this was just a horrible accidental drowning where nobody else was involved. But if that independent lab recovers foreign DNA under his nails, it changes everything we know about this case. It would legally mandate an immediate shift from a simple death investigation into a full-blown homicide investigation. The stakes literally could not be higher for this family, his friends, and the entire community waiting for the truth. This brings us to a very serious question about how our justice system handles conflicting information when a life has been lost. If the independent autopsy in D.C. reveals deep tissue marks or missing froth or foreign DNA that were completely not noted in the preliminary state evaluation, what is the legal process for reconciling two conflicting medical reports in a court of law? You simply cannot have two different realities existing at the same time when a grieving mother is looking for answers. Usually, if a private autopsy finds solid scientific evidence of a crime that the state missed or ignored, the family's attorneys will take those findings straight to a judge. Sometimes they even bypass the local courts entirely and hand the evidence over to the federal government or the Department of Justice. They use the independent science to argue that the local jurisdiction either failed in their duties, rushed the process, or is somehow compromised. It essentially becomes a high-stakes battle of experts on the witness stand. The state's pathologist will have to defend their initial superficial scan and their timeline, while the private pathologist will present their microscopic slides, their DNA swabs, and their lab data. For Nolan's family, they are hoping the science will speak loudly and clearly for the boy who can no longer speak for himself. They want the raw, unedited truth of what happened on the northwest tip of Horn Island, and they are more than willing to fight through the courts, the online rumors, and the agonizing wait times to get it. We are watching a family turn their profound grief into relentless action, demanding that every single physical clue is treated with the gravity and respect it deserves. It is a long, difficult road ahead, but as the lab results get closer, the truth of those 3 physical red flags is finally going to come to light. So while everyone is waiting for those physical red flags to either be proven or dismissed, the silence from the authorities is creating a massive vacuum. And you know what fills a vacuum, right? Rumors. Right now, there is an unverified claim circulating all over social media that suggests the state is intentionally locking down the lab results to orchestrate a local cover-up. You log online and people are furious, asking why it takes weeks to figure out how a young, healthy athlete died. They see a grieving family left in the dark and they immediately suspect the worst. But if we want the truth, we have to look at what the people inside the labs are actually dealing with. According to the coroner, the official cause of death is strictly withheld not because of a conspiracy, but because standard laboratory procedures legally require several weeks to complete. I see why it feels like a stall tactic to the public. I really do. When you are hurting and missing someone you love, every single day feels like a lifetime. But the reality of complex blood and organ screening is that it relies on highly specific scientific instruments. We are primarily talking about gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. Now, I do not want to sound like a textbook here, but it is important you understand what is actually happening behind those closed doors. Technicians have to process peripheral blood, and they also test vitreous fluid, which is the clear gel inside the eyes. They use these samples to separate complex chemical mixtures into individual molecular components. Think of the gas chromatograph like a massive microscopic filter. It literally vaporizes the biological sample and pushes it through this incredibly tiny column. What it does is separate all the different substances based on their boiling points and chemical polarity. Then, the mass spectrometer takes over. It bombards those isolated molecules with electrons, measuring their exact mass-to-charge ratio. Wow, it is incredibly precise. This process allows scientists to identify the presence of trace sedatives, alcohol, or any other incapacitating substances down to the absolute nanogram. According to forensic experts, technicians must legally take weeks to isolate these chemical compounds. They have to calibrate the machinery against known pharmaceutical libraries and run secondary confirmation tests. They do all of this because they know exactly what is at stake. They have to ensure the final data is completely accurate and, most importantly, courtroom ready. If they rush it and get it wrong, the entire case could fall apart in front of a judge. But that scientific waiting game is clashing hard with the logistical nightmares happening on the outside. There is another unverified claim circulating on social media right now. It claims that administrative delays during the transport of Nolan's body were a deliberate bottleneck created by local officials just to frustrate the family. When you hear that, it makes your blood boil, right? But let us look at the legal realities. As stated by the family attorney, the independent team did successfully secure the body, and they are continuing their physical and microscopic analysis in a private facility as we speak. Getting to that point, however, is not as simple as just hiring an ambulance and driving away. The logistical breakdown of transporting a body across state lines involves some incredibly rigid legal requirements. Bypassing local authorities entirely requires securing a formal, signed release from the Jackson County coroner. You have to arrange specialized medical transport that can preserve the body perfectly, and you have to maintain a strict, documented chain of custody across multiple state jurisdictions. If even one piece of paper is missing, or if the temperature in the transport is not logged correctly, defense attorneys can throw the whole independent autopsy out of court later. While the public perceives this transit friction as a deliberate delay by bitter local cops, the truth is that the administrative logistics of moving biological evidence to a federal district like Washington, D.C. routinely create complex logistical hurdles. It is a slow, agonizing bureaucratic machine, and unfortunately, a grieving family is caught right in the middle of its gears. Now, discussions online focus heavily on how an independent facility could completely overturn the state's narrative, and that is exactly what the family is praying for. According to the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, they still retain active jurisdiction and are conducting a thorough, ongoing death investigation. They still officially point toward a tragic drowning, but the independent pathologists who are actually funded by Colin Kaepernick, stepping in to support the family, are tasked with finding irrefutable microscopic trauma that the preliminary visual scan in Mississippi may have completely missed. They are not just looking at the surface of his skin, they are going incredibly deep. This includes analyzing the internal structures of the neck for deep tissue hemorrhaging. They're looking closely for fractures to the hyoid bone. The hyoid is this tiny, fragile bone shaped almost like a horseshoe, located high up in the neck. According to forensic pathologists, a fractured hyoid bone definitively points to manual strangulation or asphyxiation prior to submersion. It is extremely rare for that bone to break in a simple drowning or a fall into the water. Right? If they find that, it changes absolutely everything. They're also looking for something called petechial hemorrhaging. These are tiny, burst microscopic capillaries, usually found in the eyes, the eyelids, or inside the mouth. They are caused by a sudden, violent restriction of venous blood flow from the head. I see. It is exactly what happens when someone is struggling to breathe because their airway is physically blocked or compressed by someone else. If the Washington, D.C. laboratory finds these specific markers, it directly contradicts the state's preliminary drowning report in a way that local authorities simply cannot ignore. You cannot just brush away a fractured neck bone or burst eye capillaries as a swimming accident. This brings us to the ultimate strategy behind everything the family and their legal team are doing. In legal precedents where independent autopsies successfully demonstrate pre-mortem trauma that was ignored by local authorities, civil rights attorneys use that conflicting medical data to bypass the local police entirely. They use it to directly petition the Department of Justice. The ultimate goal of securing this indisputable laboratory science is to sidestep the local law enforcement statements. They want to legally force federal agencies like the FBI to step in and take total control of the investigation. They believe that is the only way Nolan will actually get justice, free from any local bias. But all of this leaves us grappling with some really heavy questions that go far beyond just the mechanics of this one investigation. We hear coroners routinely state that toxicology takes weeks to ensure accuracy, and we know they are scientifically correct. But how can independent laboratories balance a grieving family's desperate need for immediate answers with the rigorous time constraints required for solid scientific testing? It is a heartbreaking tug of war between emotional closure and forensic perfection. Every day that passes without an answer is another day of pure agony for a mother who just wants to know what happened to her son on that beach. Furthermore, bypassing local authorities for an independent out-of-state autopsy is a massive, significant legal step. It is bold, and it sends a clear message that the family does not trust the police. But what procedural hurdles do private investigators face when trying to access the primary scene and the initial state data? Think about it. By the time the independent team gets involved, the local cops have already cordoned off the beach, collected the physical items, and interviewed the friends who had the cell phone. The private team is basically playing catch-up, relying on secondary access and trying to rebuild a puzzle when the state might be holding some of the most important pieces. We are watching a deeply human tragedy unfold, caught between the slow wheels of science and the rapid fire of public opinion. At the center of it all is an 18-year-old boy who went out to celebrate a holiday and never came home. As we wait for those final lab results to drop and reveal the absolute truth about those physical red flags, we have to keep our focus on the facts. We have to separate the online noise from the verified evidence, and we have to remember the profound human loss at the heart of this mystery. Thank you so much for staying with me till the end of this deep dive. Please subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases for more truth, and take care.